Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 47 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Gavin, are we going to even keep up the facade with the calendar anymore, or what are we doing with this?
Well, seeing as I am back in my blanket fort and the
Where you
calendar
belong.
the calendar is not, that's going to be a hard no.
We're not saying that we will never bring the calendar back between now and the end of the year, but it's looking less and less likely, considering the calendar was it just
Bad.
wasn't a good situation. Yeah. It wasn't good for anyone involved. So I do have, however, when I found out we weren't doing the calendar, I just quickly looked up November 3rd in history,
Which
which
is
is when this episode
actually,
comes out.
it's pretty
Yeah.
convenient because it
Oh,
kind of goes along with this episode because we're talking about something historical in paleontology instead of like a group or or some kind of process like evolution or plate tectonics. Instead, we were doing an episode much more akin to our episode about the Bone Wars. So I'm very excited because this
if
is
you,
this is a really an episode that I had a lot of fun preparing.
and so if you haven't listened to our episode on the Bone Wars, that was goodness, was that like 30 episodes ago now? That was
Yeah, that
a
was
while
pretty
ago this week.
early. That was
That
early.
was that was definitely one of one of the first ones I was like, whoa, this was a really good piece of, I don't want to call it investigative journalism, but like a really good piece of, highlighting something that, isn't talked about a whole lot. So if you haven't had a chance, go listen to that. But I do have a couple of things from November 3rd in history that happened though.
Absolutely. Hit
So
me.
the first one of them is related to the Bone Wars in the stupidest possible way, actually.
Oh,
So we'll get there in a second. But the first one here, in 1957, the first dog was put into space aboard Sputnik 2. Um,
interesting. Okay.
yes, and I forget the name of this dog. I will look it up in just a second.
At one
Um,
point in time, I knew it, but I don't anymore.
yes, if I remember correctly, it was like a stray dog um, that was not supposed to survive the mission. Leica, that was it.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah,
There it is.
Moscow Pop. Yeah, and it was it's sort of a sad story, but it is a scientific marvel. So that
Yeah.
happens today in history. And the second one, the one that's related to the Bone Wars, the reason why it's related to the Bone Wars is because it took place in 1969. Do you get it?
Oh my.
Do you get it though?
Like I am obliged to say nice.
Nice.
But go ahead. What do you have to say?
This is actually you could not have said that with any more disdain for me.
No, I could not have.
The good news, it's actually a much more wholesome thing than that. So in 1969, PBS was established.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and so
I love PBS.
Yeah, well, I can't pretend like I watch a whole hell of a lot of PBS.
Not anymore.
Think we're
but...
right. I think we're a pro PBS podcast.
Absolutely.
Is the official stance.
Yeah,
keep Big Bird around.
I watched so many PBS shows when I was a kid. I believe Zaboomafoo was a PBS show, if I'm not mistaken.
About that. So
I love Zaboomafoo. That was like one of my favorite shows growing up. I looked forward to it every week.
Zaboomafoo was wonderful. And what happened was myself and my girlfriend and a number of other people were out playing trivia. This is well over here. This is in the before times.
Okay.
And they asked a question, what animal was Zaboomafoo? And everybody at the friggin' table knew it was a lemur. But the person that was writing everything down, our answers for us, he put down some other ridiculous animal that I'd never heard of, even though we all said lemur, and we got the question wrong. And to this day, going on 2 years later, we have not let him forget it. Nor do we have any intention of letting him forget it.
Right. And again, once upon a time, I knew what kind of lemur he was, but I do not anymore. But and the Pratt brothers, I believe, are making another PBS show.
I believe I remember hearing that the brothers that ran Zaboomafoo are like big children's programming host people.
Yeah, absolutely. And correctly. I don't know if it was specifically PBS, but I did see that recently they announced that they are doing something nature-y for media. So who knows?
Well, wonderful for them. They made an impact on certainly both of our lives with
Yeah, totally.
Zaboomafoo. So that is November 3rd in history, but we have a different history episode to go over today, and this is not one of the ones that I'm hosting. Gavin is still in charge of this one. So Gavin, let's talk about what it says in our notes here. The biggest hoax in paleontology, which is that clickbait? Is that what that is, or is that
No,
real?
this is absolutely real.
All right.
And I would argue potentially the most famous scientific hoax of all time? Question mark.
Well, I have some definition questions on that one, but okay.
We will
Like
talk
what counts
about
as a scientific hoax? But
we
okay,
will
I'm
talk
curious
about what
what's
constitutes a hoax later.
okay. I'm curious what constitutes a scientific hoax. Like what does that mean, and what else is in competition about it? I assume that
Okay.
we will get to all of that later on if it becomes relevant. But yeah,
hmm
let's go ahead and get started.
So we're going to be talking about the case of the Piltdown Man from 1912.
I'm already bored.
So we need to do a little context, as with everything in history. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. Things happen around it that affect it. So while the event actually starts in 1912, we need to actually go back a little farther to the late 1800s, early 1900s, when people were really getting interested in human evolution. So, as we've talked about, in 1859, Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, definitely his best known work. However, later in 1871, Darwin publishes a much less known book called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. So, this is where he talks about human evolution, as well as he lays out many more thoughts about sexual selection than he did in Origin of Species.
Are
So,
these thoughts all specific to humans, or are they meant to be applied to other animals like we talk about sexual selection now?
yeah, it was. So, there were different parts of it that focused on humans, and then the sexual selection stuff talked about humans, but also talked about, peacocks and the other stereotypical sexual selection animals.
Okay, so this was not just a human book.
No.
Okay.
But it put human evolution sort of in the spotlight, not for the first time, but sort of, everybody, if especially after On the Origin of Species, if Darwin published a book, people were interested. Uh, so, really quickly, this isn't in our notes, but this is something that I just kind of wanted to say. Uh, the the Descent of Man does not hold up the best.
Oh,
um, the more I
why is
looked
that?
into it, it was. So I want to be very clear that everything that I read about this said Darwin is not using this to justify racism. From everything that I could tell, Darwin, because it's 1859, while the British Empire had outlawed slavery in 1833, several other countries, notably the United States, still had slavery. And so he was very outspokenly against slavery, so pro Darwin here.
But
However,
there's a but coming.
this book is rough to read, um, because it uses just a lot of the language of the time, such as referring to people from, you know, less contacted, more remote tribes, because Darwin spent a lot of time in South America. He frequently refers to them as savages, which is obviously not good. Um, and talks in his book quite a bit about this is the book that social Darwinism actually comes from. That is not something that Darwin talked about, but it is something that people have used this book to justify. And while Darwin was also very not in favor of like eugenics, many people used this book to justify eugenics, including later the Nazis, and also some of the very eugenicsy things that the United States did in the 1900s as well. So,
That's something that I bring up. Social Darwinism is a term that gets brought up in social studies classes. It's
yeah,
part of our curriculum. That's always one of those things that kind of needs to be taught. Is it's sort of taking these rough ideas of Darwin, and sort of bastardizing them in ways
yeah,
that, as best as I'm aware of, and it sounds like from you, it is the case that Darwin never intended and never wanted
no,
that. So we have sort of a two pronged thing of Darwin using some language of his time, which evaluate that however you may, as well as
Right, yeah.
other people taking his words in ways that he probably didn't intend. So understood.
And
We're talking about a product of its time.
yeah, for sure. So, but you can't really talk about the descent of man without sort of that little asterisk. So, absolutely
So,
not the main point of this episode. So, moving
but
on.
acknowledged, noted, and that's something that
Yeah,
we always want to make sure that we acknowledge when we're talking about these things.
yeah,
We can always be
absolutely.
better and not disregard the good points that come with things.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, so in the late 1800s and mid 1800s, human-like fossils had kind of been popping up around Europe and Western Asia. Um, one that you probably have heard of, even though you didn't know it, in the Neander Valley of Germany in 1856. So this is even before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. Fossils were found of a human-like skeleton with large eyebrow ridges, a sloped forehead, and stockier limbs. And this later became known as Neanderman, and later Homo neanderthalensis, as most people would know them, Neanderthals/Neanderthals, if you are less sciencey.
So that was going to be one of my questions. Was I I have heard just like regular jabronis saying Neanderthals, and then I've heard people that want to sound fancier say Neanderthals. What is correct?
Neanderthal is correct.
Okay,
Well, it
no
kind of
H.
depends on the context. If you are saying somebody is like a quote unquote degenerate sort of Neanderthal is probably the accurate, but if you're actually referring to the population of humans, because these are actual humans, like if you were to see one walking around, you probably wouldn't notice. Like if you were to see a Neanderthal in a crowd of Homo sapiens, you probably wouldn't really be able to pick that person out. They wouldn't be really noticeable. So like they're absolutely human. Um, but so if you're actually referring to the other species of humans, that's relatively recent. Neanderthal. If you're insulting somebody, Neanderthal.
Never thought we'd be giving insult advice on this podcast, but it took us 47 episodes. Here we are.
Absolutely. So uh, later, also around the same, well, yeah, also around the same time in France. So another place in Europe that was doing a lot of science at the time. Skeletons. You may have heard of the phrase a Cro-Magnon, which is
This
just
sounds familiar.
a general phrase for like primitive humans. But they were at the time just I don't think they were given this name at the time, but they have since become known as Cro-Magnon very early, like the first Homo sapiens to kind of get to Europe. Um, so they interbred quite a bit with Neanderthals and showed some Neanderthal traits despite them still being our species, Homo sapiens. Similar discoveries in Spain, Belgium, other European countries. And one of the few places in Europe that did not have specimens found that related to human evolution were the British Isles, which becomes very important. Fast forward now to 1910, and there still had been no human fossils found in Britain, despite there being found in many more in the rest of Europe, as well as some, like I said, in Western Asia and also some parts of China. And Europeans were still learning a little bit more about evolution, or human evolution specifically, but they kind of didn't like what they had been observing.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by didn't like it?
So, some specimens of Homo erectus, which is, I believe, the most basal, so the earliest species in the genus Homo, our genus, uh, had been found in Java, which is an island in the Indo-Pacific, and northern China. And despite having a body more or less like modern humans like us, maybe a little smaller, but all the bones were the same proportions. They were obviously very much, walking upright like we do. Um, Despite its body being basically human, its head and brain were still much smaller than ours.
Okay.
And as well as Neanderthal fossils, see, even I do it sometimes.
Easy mistake
Neanderthal
to make.
fossils, yeah, they appeared, sort of brute-like to the fancy Europeans. They didn't like that it somewhat resembled an ape with the bigger eyebrow ridges, a more sloped forehead instead of our big honking flat forehead. Uh, so they basically they just didn't like what they were seeing because to them, in their minds, the human brain was what made humans special, which is not untrue. But there are many other things. We have not done an episode about human evolution. We will at some point. Um, but they really thought that because the brain was what differentiated humans from other animals and how specialized it is, that it must have been evolving for the longest amount of time and should have developed first. They were looking essentially for an ape-like body with a human-like skull and brain, but that is not what the fossils showed.
So they were upset because the fossil record did not bear out what they had thought and assumed and believed to be true. Is that like that's why they were getting upset?
Yes.
Okay.
And also, obviously, the obligatory also racism uh,
It went.
thing. So there was some evidence coming through that human ancestors were found in Africa. That comes a little bit later, but there was some, whispers about it at this time. Rich white people didn't like that. They're like, oh, we couldn't possibly be from Africa, of all places, because racism. And uh, yeah, so there was just a large amount of humans are so high and mighty that we must have come from Europe, of course, and not just that, but Eastern or Western Europe. They must have come from, you know, places like Spain or Germany or France. The higher societies, which is not true, not even close. And there was
Yeah,
also
you ever met someone from France? Come on.
I have actually.
I had a French foreign exchange student one time. She
Oh,
was
okay.
very lovely.
I think the only one I know is our friend Kirsten. They had a French foreign exchange student go to their school that I
Oh,
met at her
really?
graduation party. Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm
Anyway,
sure he was lovely.
he was. And so there was also, and you being a history teacher, probably know that in the early
Oh
19
boy.
teens, there was a lot of nationalism going on. I always learned that that was a major influence of World War I. Just extreme nationalism.
That's part of it. Yeah.
Again, one of many things, but so
There's
it
a lot
was.
going on.
Oh,
It's not
of
all one
course,
thing, but yeah, there's you're right. We are talking a little bit about nationalism well before we get there now, but it's all it's all a circle.
right. And so it was a very big point of pride of all of these European countries that they had human fossils, and it was kind of embarrassing for the British that they didn't. And then,
Huh. Okay.
miraculously, in
Miraculous.
1912,
Uh-huh.
an incredible specimen was discovered.
Can I take a guess what it is?
Sure,
I have not looked at the notes. Was it some sort of human fossil in the British Isles that was totally real?
it was not.
Oh, damn it. All right, fine.
But
God.
spoilers, we'll get there.
Okay. So we're not going to say what it is now.
So, the keeper of geology, who I believe, like, I don't think that's like the title anymore. I believe that's more or less a curator, somebody who manages like collections and a researcher essentially at the London Museum of Natural History, whose name
Hmm.
was Arthur Smith Woodward. He will keep coming up, so uh, we'll just refer to him as Woodward. Received a letter from a Mr. Charles Dawson, another Charlie D, but Dawson will also keep coming up. So Woodward received a letter from Dawson, who was a lawyer and an amateur scientist from Sussex, about a particular skull that he had found in the Piltdown area of Sussex, which is just sort of like how like New York City has like many different little neighborhoods or cities within it, similar thing.
Okay.
So Woodward headed out to the site. After a little while, there was a little bit of a delay just because of work things, but he went out to the site, and after the skull was examined, he was convinced that England finally had its human. And so this was a partial
Oh,
skull with some fragments. The skull was a dark brownish hue due to its age, and the bones appeared relatively thick, which I have yet to find a reason why they thought this. but which that apparently implied that it was primitive and older.
Sure.
I've yet to read somebody's explanation as to their reasoning behind that, but that increased them thinking that it was old. So it was also sort of found around some elephant and hippo fossils, which increased its validity. So it wasn't just, hey, I found this skull in my yard. There were other fossils around it.
Right.
And based on the fossils around the skull, the site was given a date of around 500,000 years ago, which at the time made it the oldest human ancestor known.
You said 500,000?
Yes.
Good. Do we, even with our modern understanding, do humans go back that far?
It depends what you mean by human.
That's okay. I assume that was the answer. Okay. All right, continue.
The genus Homo, I believe, gets close to that. I'm not. There's a reason why this isn't a human evolution episode. I did not do that much research. I believe Homo erectus gets around that far. I don't know though. But yeah, at the time, we didn't even know what the lineage that humans came from. We knew we were primates. We knew we were apes, but we hadn't really found. We hadn't found anything more closely related to us than to chimpanzees. That wasn't already pretty human. So
Okay.
that has very much changed since then. Human evolution is incredibly well understood, but we didn't know that at the time. So back to the Piltdown Man, they dug more around the site and they found some primitive stone tools, and importantly, a partial jaw. So I've talked before, mammals especially are best identified by their teeth. Mammals have incredibly specialized teeth and are very easily recognizable from the other. So they found a jaw, and it was missing a few of the front teeth, including the canine teeth, and the area where the jaw articulates to the skull. But so they had most of a jaw. The teeth in
Mm-hmm.
the jaw were incredibly human-like in the way they are worn. The way you use your teeth wears them differently. And
Right.
so they were very, very human-like. And it appeared to have a somewhat sort of side-to-side wear pattern that is seen in humans but not in apes. But other than the teeth, the jaw itself was very, very ape-like and very robust, unlike human jaws or previous human jaws like Neanderthal jaws that had been found to that point.
So this sounds like a really interesting specimen. Like there's kind of a foot in the ape world, there's a foot in, human world. There's some different factors pointing in other direction, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And this sort of reinforced what they had been thinking, because the parts of the skull that they didn't have a whole skull, they had parts, but the parts that they had looked very, very human. Old human, but it is looked more or less like a regular modern human skull. But the jaws were ape-like, which is what they had anticipated from before.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in December of 1912, the specimen, which had been dubbed the Piltdown Man, that was very common to just kind of call them where they're from, man, like with Neander Man,
Sure.
This was published in Nature magazine, and given the name Eoanthropus dawsoni, which means Dawson. So the person who wrote the letter to the museum, it means Dawson's Dawn Man, because at the time it was the earliest. So it was given a full scientific name, fully published and everything. And also in December of 1912, the New York Times had two separate headlines, only a couple days apart, that read, the first one went, "Paleolithic skull is a missing link." And the second one says, "Darwin's theory is proved true." So this was a massive deal. Just
So
because it was found in England, everybody knew about
this made it
this.
out of just regular like science circles, and this made it to
Absolutely.
just the general population,
Yeah,
proving Darwin true and everything. Okay.
absolutely. And like I said, this was just a massive, massive deal. It was older than Neanderthals. It suggested, at least at the time, that Neanderthals must have been some uh, evolutionary reversal to ape-like skull traits, and not our actual ancestor, which is partially true. So, like, Neanderthals are not our ancestor; they are sort of our sister. And so, but reversals in character traits do happen. Not much, but they do. But at the time, they were like, oh, it evolved backwards, which is not really a thing. Um, and because this was from around the same time as Java Man, one of the specimens that was found on Java, which since we have called Homo erectus, one of the earliest Homo species, it was concluded that Java Man must be an offshoot from the more ape-like ancestors that came before the Piltdown Man. So we were descended from Piltdown Man, not from Java Man.
Okay.
Again, I think pretty much the only justification for this was because, hey, we like this one. This one confirms what we had thought before.
Right. It goes with that whole sort of Eurocentric, I guess
Yeah.
British centric in this case,
Yep.
idea here. I'm still waiting for the big fraud part, but okay.
We'll get there.
Okay.
The dig in Piltdown was continued through the mid-19 teens, recovering one lower canine tooth, which had been missing from the jaw, that looked exactly like precisely like what had been proposed in a reconstruction. Because it's common to, if you only have parts of a bone, just based on our understanding of biology and anatomy, to fill in the rest. You have to be very clear that what parts you do and do not have, but it is common to fill in the blanks in papers to just give an idea what the animal looked like in general.
Okay.
So they
Like
had,
artist representation kind of thing?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so they had drawn in a canine tooth in a diagram, even though it was not part of the original specimen, but they had found one that looked exactly like what had been proposed, in addition to some more artifacts as well. And then also in 1915, Dawson had claimed to find another partial skull at a different site about 2 miles away. So this was, increasing its validity. There's more specimens found from the same site, more specimens found at different sites. So, corroboration. There's multiple lines of supporting evidence, which is what we like in science. Then, in 1916, Dawson dies. I don't remember reading why. I'm sure that it is known why, but apparently was not important, or they would have mentioned it. And
Okay.
the second skull was published by Woodward in 1917. So we're now 5 years after the initial publication. Piltdown Man was not without its criticism, though. Not everybody liked it and agreed, particularly outside of England. Many scientists outside of England, a lot of them in North America, because they didn't really have skin in the game, with all the different European countries, they were sort of competing with each other to be like, the first human was a Brit, the first human was a Frenchman. Whereas
Because that's the thing that matters.
exactly, right? Like, so a lot of scientists in North America were like, I don't think I buy this. Like, this seems very weird. Like, a lot of things about the specimen seemed odd just because they were contradicting a lot of other things, such as like the Neanderthal specimens and the Java Man specimens. So many people did not believe this. Not necessarily that they thought it was fake, but that they were like, I don't think that this is on our branch, is closer to us than chimps or other apes, but like, it's not like our grandpa, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And one German scientist, Franz Weidenreich, Wiedenreich. I don't speak German. Anyway, so a German
Vons.
scientist. Huh?
We'll just go with Vons for now.
So Franz.
Franz. Okay.
Yes. So Franz W. suggested that the first Piltdown skull and jaw was, quote, the artificial combination of fragments of a modern human brain case and an orangutan-like mandible and teeth.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. So this German scientist suggests that the first set, not the second skull, the first one that was published, quote, the artificial combination of fragments of a human brain case and an orangutan-like mandible and teeth.
So he's saying that this is two species that are being just put together by humans? Is that what he's trying to say?
That is exactly right. He was saying this is fake. This is not a real animal. He's like, those bones are probably real, but they were not together.
Without knowing anything else, I would have tendency to, if not believe him, at least to give him some credibility.
Right. But at the time, that was very much an outside opinion, particularly in Europe in general. But
well, I mean, I can imagine, because then that kind of ruins the whole, that ruins the whole bit that they were doing.
Right. So here we're going to take a little break and talk about a fraud or a hoax versus a mistake, because they are not the same. Many people kind of conflate them, but they are not the same. So a fraud or a hoax is something purposeful. There is intent. Somebody knew that this was wrong, but did it anyway. And it was there was a goal behind it. Whereas a mistake is something more honest, like you just missed something, you didn't catch something. And there have been lots of careless mistakes for sure. In the Bone Wars episode, we talked at one point about Edward Drinker Cope putting the head at the wrong end of a plesiosaur, and instead of putting it on the long, snaky neck, he put it on the end of the tail, thinking that it had a short neck and had a long tail.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a mistake. A very, very careless mistake, because we had known about plesiosaurs at that point.
But he was trying his best.
Right. He was being very careless, but it was not like he was trying to deceive people.
Right.
Another one that is sort of in the same vein of human evolution, there is sort of another human specimen from North America that was known as Nebraska Man, because it was found in Nebraska.
Shocker.
And this turned out to not be human at all, which is probably not surprising. Before, Native American populations got here, only, tens of, I'd say like less than 20,000 years ago or so, maybe more. I'm not quite sure. But in the dozens of thousands of years ago, instead of the hundreds of thousands of years ago. So this was actually a peccary tooth, because it was just found from a single tooth. And so a peccary is essentially North America's answer to pigs, because pigs do not natively live in the Americas. They're exclusively Eurasian and African.
Oh.
But they're very closely related, and if you saw one, you wouldn't really know the difference. They're very, very pig-like. But pigs and peccaries actually have extremely human-like teeth.
Do they still taste as good?
Peccaries?
Yes.
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know that.
All right, let's get on that.
But that was an honest mistake, because, like I said, the teeth, at least the molars of peccaries, look very human-like. So it was just a misidentification. There was no intent. This was not like somebody was saying, lying purposefully, where they knew it was a peccary and were like, this is a human fossil. No, this was just a genuine mistake. And that is the big difference between a fraud and a hoax, as we'll see, because there's no possible way that this event, the Piltdown Man, could have happened by accident. There's just no way. So, back to Piltdown Man. After Dawson's death in 2016, 1916. 1916. Yes. So after the guy who found the first one and the second one, after he died, no new Piltdown specimens were found at either of the two sites or anywhere else in England or Europe or the world.
So this was just by sheer coincidence. This guy happened to find the only two specimens that ever existed.
That is correct.
I'm sensing the hoax.
Elsewhere in the world, however, new human specimens were popping up everywhere. In the 1920s, lots of new Homo erectus specimens from Asia, the Indo-Pacific were found. And keep in mind, Homo erectus is the most primitive human, or I guess Homo genus species, so old. And then Australopithecus africanus was found in Africa. If you have not heard of Australopithecus, that is the species that we are extremely confident, or the I don't remember if I said genus or species, but the genus that we are very, very confident that our genus evolved from. So these are our direct ancestors were found in Africa. Again, very human-like body, not as human-like as Homo erectus or Neanderthals, but still quite human-like, but their heads were even smaller.
And these were found in Africa?
Yes.
Okay.
In the 1930s, several other species of Australopithecus were found, all in Africa, and many new Neanderthal specimens have been found all across Europe. So they had been finding them all over the place. Africa, Asia, the rest of Europe. No new Piltdown specimens. And in 1935, England even got its own real human-like fossil. I didn't find too many new details about that, but they did get an actual one. However, it is now 1935. It is 23 years after the first Piltdown specimen was published.
Okay.
And people still thought it was real.
When you say people, like, did the scientific community think it was
Everybody.
real?
Obviously, like that Franz dude, some people were like, no, this is fake.
So there were some people sounding, blowing the whistle, but for the most part, this was just taken as fact.
Yes, absolutely. And so then, at this point, all of these fossils continued to sort of stack the odds against Piltdown Man, and all of them suggested that the human body form, standing upright, not walking like chimpanzees on mostly your hands and on your knuckles, essentially. Chimps can walk on their hind legs, just not very well or for very long, but they can do it. And that the human brain and skull developed after. So, literally every other fossil find by this point in the mid-30s contradicted Piltdown Man.
Which should have been a clue.
Right. That at least if, it was real still, that it was not, that this was the weird offshoot. Not Neanderthals, not Java Man, that this was the weird one. And through all this time, the Piltdown Man specimens were still kept at the British Museum of Natural History, and people there were really choosy about who they let see the bones.
So they probably had a clue that something wasn't quite above board.
Not necessarily. That's not entirely unusual. So bones, and fossil bones in particular, are generally really fragile, not just to like touching them, but to like air and light. So
there can be some actual like reason to be a little bit more secretive and protective.
Right, particularly for what are called holotypes. I've talked about these before, but these are when you name a new species, you have to designate a what's called a holotype, which is sort of the specimen that you compare other specimens to figure out, is this species. So, for example, my grad school had I spent lots and lots of time in our collections space. We have a separate holotype collection space that I did not go in. I had, like, they let me explore pretty much everywhere, but that was one place where it's like, if you don't have business in there, you do not go there, because that is the specimen, especially in a case like this, where it is something incredibly unique and something that, especially at the time, changed how we saw a very significant part of human evolution. And so that was not entirely unusual, but it kind of plays into why it took so long to figure out. So I don't think that this was intentional. I
Mhm.
think that this was probably just being careful and treating specimens correctly.
Okay, and because of that, because somebody was trying to do the right thing with protecting bones, or at least as far as we can tell,
Yeah.
that sort of contributes to the lack of full understanding that was going
Yes.
on.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And so people who still supported Piltdown Man as being valid kind of argued that others weren't actually directly ancestral to humans, and that the Piltdown Man was, or kind of the opposite, that Piltdown Man was still valid, but that it was the weird offshoot of our lineage, sort of like I was saying before. But other than a handful of people, most people still kind of believed that this was still a real specimen, a real valid species. And sort of as the science progressed, as our techniques for mostly chemistry things progressed through the mid 1900s, new techniques for putting in accurate dates and ages to fossils began to develop, which is really interesting.
Is this like carbon dating?
I think carbon dating comes a little later. This is a different thing that we'll talk about a little in a second here.
Okay.
So in 1949, 37 years after the first specimen was published,
Which is longer than you or I have been alive.
yes, Kenneth Oakley of the British Museum of Natural History, so this is not an outside person, this is somebody there at the museum, used one of these techniques called fluorine dating on the bones in the skull fragments and the jaw. So fluorine dating, essentially, so groundwater has fluorine dissolved in it. And as groundwater flows around buried fossils, some of the fluorine will like leach into bones. This really only works for pretty recent things. Uh, but based on how much fluorine it has sucked up, you can roughly tell how long it was buried. Which, in the case of
Okay.
something that was potentially only 500,000 years old, that's a relatively short time. You can use fluorine dating for that.
I mean, that seems reasonable and effective.
Right. And so it's not incredibly exact, but at the time this was kind of the best they had. So they were able to test the Piltdown Man bones and compare them to the fossil animal bones from the site. So all they did was test some of like those hippo or elephant bones that I mentioned earlier, and the Piltdown jaw and the Piltdown skull fragments. What the results said from that is that the animal fossils were around 10 times older than the Piltdown Man bones, which would put them at roughly 50,000 years old instead of 500,000, which in terms of human evolution is absolutely massive.
Yeah, I mean, that is like it's like an order of magnitude. You're adding a zero there.
Exactly. And Homo sapiens are thought to have, I don't know if they knew this at the time, but we showed up around, give or take, 250 to 300,000. So they're like this thing was bumping elbows with us. What the heck is this thing? And because of this result, people kind of freaked out. People were like, why? By this point, like, it was pretty much just us and Neanderthals left for our relatives at this point. There were some other populations. I think there's um, Homo floresiensis, which is,
Oh, that's a fun one. I have
yeah,
not heard of that before, but
it's
that's a great one to say.
yeah, it is a island dwarf species of human found on
Island
the
dwarf
island of
species of
Flores.
human.
Yeah, just like in our
Sweet.
elephants episode, when big animals get to islands, they tend to kind of shrink because there's
Puppy-sized
not as much
elephants.
food. Yeah. So this, humans are fairly large animals, even though we don't really consider ourselves that big. And so when this population of humans got to the island of Flores, which is in the Indo-Pacific, they shrunk. So, but yeah, I believe that there were just the 3 species of humans left at that point. And so they were like, what was this thing doing? And what was it doing here? You know, if this is still that kind of ape like, shouldn't you be around the other apes?
That would make sense.
And then fast forward a couple more years. In 1953, 41 years after the first publication, Oakley, the same scientist who did the last study, performed a more refined fluorine test because the technology had just gotten better on these bones and determined that the skull pieces had around 3 times the fluorine as the jaw,
Which
suggesting that they
means
were different ages.
which means they were not part of the same species, because if they were the same species, those bones would have gotten there at the same time and they would have absorbed the exact same amount of, you said fluorine, is it?
Yes.
Is that, do I have it
So,
right?
yes, yep.
Okay.
More or less. You can, different species are around for different times, but that is the logic. Yes, these certainly did not belong to the same individual for sure.
Okay.
Um, and this prompted an extreme sort of re-review of the morphology of the actual specimens themselves. And it turned out that the skull, indeed, just as they thought, was very human-like. In fact, it was Homo sapiens. But the jaw likely belonged to an orangutan, just like Franz the German guy said.
All those years ago.
Yes. So it took 40 years for this hoax to be discovered as a hoax.
So now you say hoax, and you mentioned before, hoax is somebody acting in bad faith. So we know that this was wrong and erroneous.
Yes.
How do we know it's a hoax?
Well, because the odds of all of the things to mislead these scientists was astronomical. So let's run down a quick list
Let's do it.
of how these things were altered. So the skull and jaw were chemically stained to make them appear older. That's why I specified at the beginning that the skull had like a darker color, so that it wasn't just, white bone like it would be from a normal human.
That's one.
The skulls, both at the first and the second site, appeared to be chosen for their thickness, which potentially was due to a pathological condition, so some kind of disease that they had, or it was possible that they could have been chemically treated to make them swell a little bit.
Okay.
And
Two.
they were dated later, well after the 50s, to have been dated to like medieval times. So they're still archaeological, but not human evolution.
These would have some significance in many other contexts, just not the one that, wound up
Right.
being chosen for them.
A really big line of evidence is that the teeth in the jaw, because orangutan teeth are not that much like human teeth. They're similar, obviously, we're fairly closely related, but human teeth are very unique because we are pretty omnivorous. We can eat just about anything. Orangutans are pretty, obligate herbivores if they eat meat, it is very rarely. And they also have much larger canine teeth than we do, as do most apes. Uh, and the teeth in the jaw were filed down meticulously to be given a human-like wear pattern.
Which that's a pretty good indication that this
Yes,
is somebody who knows what they're doing, or at least knows what they're trying to
exactly.
do.
Exactly. The condyle of the jaw, which is that spot where the jaw connects to the skull, was likely specifically broken off because ape jaws simply just can't fit with a human skull. They just don't fit because human skulls are very weird. So,
Hmm.
because it was missing that one specific spot, it kind of just let scientists draw it however they wanted when they did their reconstructions.
Okay.
That canine tooth that was found, like I said, it was found after the publication, and it was literally exactly as they thought it would look. The other fossils in the site might have been from around England, but one source that I found actually said that they could have been transported from as far away as Malta, which is an island, I believe, also in the Indo-Pacific, or Tunisia, which I believe is a country in Africa.
So we've
And
got just a bunch of things coming from other places being brought to Great Britain
yes,
to be quote unquote discovered.
yes. And lastly, the stone tools that were found around these specimens were likely made with a steel knife.
Just
Yeah, so
I don't know why that one's the funny one to me. I don't understand, but there's just something glorious about all of that, and then also the tools that come with it were made with steel. Just
right.
just chef's kiss.
So at this point, given the context of all of this evidence, then everyone was like, okay, this is fake. This is a fabricated specimen. The worst case scenario that can happen in science. If somebody falsifies data, that basically, it is very, very hard to get like a PhD stripped from you. Like, I can't think of a case off the top of my head where that has ever happened. I'm sure it has, but that is extremely rare. What usually happens is people just stop working with you, or in some cases, journals will not publish papers by you. So at this point, people were like, "Who did this? This has been a thing for 40 years. Who could have done this so well that it fooled the world for this long?" And most people kind of agree that it was Dawson,
The
because
original guy, correct?
the original guy that found and wrote the letter to Woodward, and because he was the only person present for every discovery. He was present for,
He's
obviously,
the
he
one
found
common link.
right. He found the original skull and jaw. He found, or at least was there for, the canine tooth. He found the other site that was a couple miles away. I don't know if he was there for every time they found like tools and things, but he was there for every bone of Piltdown Man that was found. Um, Also, coincidentally, the discoveries stopped after he died. That's a pretty incriminating thing. But a lot of people kind of argue that he probably didn't have the like anatomy knowledge to have known how to do it this well.
Are they saying that he was too dumb, or that he just like this was not his thing?
This was just not his thing.
Okay.
So, uh, for example, would you know a lot about history and how to teach people. Would you know how to turn an orangutan tooth into a human tooth?
Not off the top of my head, no. I may have to make a few phone calls for that one.
Yeah, so neither likely would Dawson, because he enjoyed science, but this was not what he did. He was a lawyer primarily. And so a lot of people also kind of point the finger toward Woodward, the guy from the museum that Dawson wrote to.
As sort of like a man behind the curtain. Like he
Sort
was
of.
sort of
Yeah.
okay.
Because Woodward would have had the knowledge to do it. He would have known that you can't have the tip of the jaw, where it articulates to the skull, that can't be there because it wouldn't fit. He would have known, how to properly file the teeth and such. But Dawson definitely would have had to be in on it as well if that were the case. And
Remind me again with all of this as we're
yeah,
trying to figure out who did this. Was it just one person? Was it a conspiracy amongst multiple people? What's the point? Like, was anybody getting rich off of this? Was it just you know, the odd nationalistic pride of knowing the first human was within your present day borders? Like, what's the point? Was it to get your name in history books?
I think that was a big factor of it.
Which part?
The latter two, the A,
Okay.
they wanted there to be, especially in this time of extreme nationalism, they wanted the first human to be a Brit. The fame, you know, 'cause a lot of people, this is not at all the case today, really, but like scientists, at least today, do not get paid directly for their research. We've talked about this. We've had an entire episode about it.
Go listen.
But at the time, if you were the person who revolutionized our understanding of human evolution, you were a big deal. You would get paid to go speak places. You would get paid and set up really well at some kind of university where it's like you could not publish likely for like the rest of your career and still get paid pretty well. That's just how it kind of was at the time. And so the fame and the notoriety was probably also a big driving force behind it. Um, Although some things kind of contradicting, or that people who don't think it was Woodward uh, kind of argue, is that he kept working on the site and looking for fossils well after he retired. And by that point, Dawson had been dead for years.
So why
So,
would you be looking for them at that point if it was all
exactly.
fake? Okay.
Right. So, that is kind of an argument that it wasn't Woodward. I don't really have an opinion other than Dawson was absolutely involved. um,
Okay.
and then I didn't really look too much into it because the evidence didn't seem that supportive. But weirdly, Arthur Conan Doyle, the person who wrote Sherlock Holmes, was
Oh,
kind of, yeah, because I don't know if it was his main home or like a summer vacation home or something, but he had a home in Piltdown, and he was pretty. I If you were a rich white person in late 1800s, early 1900s, you probably dabbled a little bit in science. Um, and Arthur
or
Conan
what was
Doyle
called science at the
tried.
time.
Well, right. He tried, but he was also very much into mysticism. And the scientists were like, "Yeah, we don't like that. That's no.
Good for
If
them.
you like that kind of thing, you can't hang out with us." And so it was kind of argued that made him mad. And it wasn't even specifically paleontologists. It was just I don't even the people who supposedly slighted him were not paleontologists. So, but some people were like, "Well, he was in the area and he famously didn't like scientists." But it's
So there you
like,
go.
yeah. So that's basically the entire connection. But I thought that was neat, so I wanted to throw that in.
Going back to Dawson for a second, is it
Yeah.
possible? You said he was involved. Is it possible that he was like a useful idiot, to kind of phrase it crassly, where he didn't know what was going on, but he was being used by Doyle or by somebody else,
I mean,
or I shouldn't say Doyle, or Woodward or somebody else. Is that a realistic possibility, or if he was involved, he knew what was up?
yeah, he definitely would have known because, like I said at the beginning, he was an amateur scientist, so like he was interested,
Okay.
and so yeah, I just really don't think that based on everything that I've read, I'm not a historian of Piltdown Man. There are several people
You
who
are
are.
now.
Well, yeah, there are many people who have pored over every detail of this, and it doesn't seem like that. It seems like he was, if he was not the main perpetrator, he absolutely knew about it because he was the one who wrote uh, to Woodward first, you know? And it doesn't, I think they had been familiar with each other, but they didn't like know each other. Obviously, Dawson knew him, or at least knew of him well enough to be like, okay, this is the person to write to.
Okay. All right. So he
So,
he had to have had at least some awareness of what was going on.
right. So,
So Gavin,
yeah,
why do we care? Like I get it. Like this is a big deal, but who cares?
I think that this is one of the best cases to show if anybody has ever learned anything about like stage magic or even just lying, it is much, much easier to get somebody to believe a lie if they want to believe it,
Okay.
which people in England very much wanted this.
Okay. They were looking for this evidence for a long time. So once it came, it was, of course.
Exactly. They wanted it to be an Englishman. They wanted it to be human skull, ape body, which is exactly what they got. And they wanted it to be, uh, a legitimate thing. If somebody were to tell me, hey, you're going to get free video games for the rest of your life,
Okay.
that would be much easier to convince me of than if someone was like, hey, you're going to get free asparagus for the rest of your life. Just
You tell me you wouldn't be
inherently.
happy with that?
No, I don't like asparagus. Uh,
I don't
but
blame
anyway,
you.
it's just much easier to convince people of something they already think might be true or definitely what they want to be true. And in general, since this has been revealed as a hoax, many people that are anti evolution in particular and anti science in general have kind of pointed to this case as proof that science in general and paleontology specifically is fake.
I mean, we've mentioned this before. Like you said, this is the worst thing that can happen in science when somebody fakes data,
Yeah,
because then it gives everybody license to point to everything else that comes out and say that's
yeah,
fake, that's not real. How can you trust that?
exactly.
And it, at least to some extent, it's hard to blame them. A little bit, it's incredibly frustrating, but I sort of get it if they're coming at it from a good faith point of view.
I kind of don't get it as a scientist because while it took an infamously long amount of time, 40 years is not nothing in science, especially. So I understand it took a hugely long time for them to figure this out, but scientists were the ones to figure this out. You know, it's not like that many lay people cared, you know?
I get it. My only point is just like, who's to say, whatever scientific discovery comes out now, who's to say that in 40 years scientists won't discover that that's not true? I think that, as somebody who knows a thing or two about this stuff from listening to you and just, being a smart person, like that's wrong and that's the wrong way to look at things. But I have a hard time blaming somebody who just doesn't know as much about this, probably isn't as educated as you or I are, that is, you know, that's willing to be or wants to be. You said it's, people want to be. If people already want to be skeptical of these things, and then, you can point to this or that example of, of bad science being done, I sort of get where that skepticism comes from, even if I think it's misplaced, and I think better education would do a lot to fix that.
I definitely agree to a point because so the reason this I actually think this is an excellent case of science working.
I agree with you 100%. This is like you've said this a number of times here. Like bad science will always get caught,
Yeah.
by following the scientific method, and that's very clear from this example. It's a matter
Right.
of
Like the
getting everyone to
broader
believe it.
the broader evidence that was collected later contradicted this, which then made the scientists be like, let's take a harder look at this and see what's going on here, because clearly there's something going back here. And again, was a long held belief that people wanted to be true, including a lot of the scientists. This wouldn't have lasted for as long as it did if the scientists didn't also kind of want to be true. Scientists also have a huge amount of bias. That's something that everybody kind of thinks of scientists as like, the stoic, purely logical, like Spock like character. You let
Mhm.
logic purely dictate everything you do. But it's really important to
Still
acknowledge
done by
that
humans.
yeah, it's still done by people, and people are biased. Uh, whether it's inherent or like whether it's like internalized or active bias, and so but they re-examined this thing because the all of the evidence went against it, and they overturned it. And so I think that's a big slam dunk on behalf of science, even if it is extremely embarrassing. That
And this is one of those things where, like I said, I think better education and
Yeah,
teaching more people about. I think that would go a long way towards making this more of a champion of science and the scientific method instead of promoting skepticism of it.
yeah, absolutely. Um, and then the last thing that I kind of want to end with, just because I thought it was funny, uh, I didn't go into the details because I didn't feel like going down this rabbit hole,
I'm excited.
but apparently in 1952, so the year before this was revealed to be a full-on hoax, but after the first study that showed that this was definitely not the same age as the other fossils around it. So it was already kind of suspect, but not a fully revealed to be the hoax yet. L. Ron Hubbard, who, for anybody who doesn't understand why Mike is laughing, is the founder of the Church of Scientology, used this as some kind of
Oh,
evidence supporting Scientology. And
that bastard.
again, I didn't go into the
Come
details
at me,
because, like,
Church of Scientology.
the
Really
less
care.
I know about the Church of Scientology, the happier my life's gonna be. I just know that I thought it was real funny that he leaned on this, not like super hard. Obviously, this wasn't the crux of Scientology, but it was something that he used to support whatever Scientology thinks. I don't know. But literally the next year, it got revealed to be a big hoax. And then apparently, in his like big book that he published, that has been reprinted several times, there's no like editor's notes or anything that like this turned out to be fake.
It's still just like verbatim right in there.
Yeah, even I think I saw that there was a relatively recent reprint from like 2006 or 2007. And literally, to my knowledge, there was nothing about this being a hoax in there at all. So,
I
joke's on you, Scientology.
I got
I
nothing.
mean, it always is. The joke is always on Scientology, but uh, I've never had a reason to dunk on Scientology on this podcast, and I'm glad that I had that chance.
I am thrilled that we got to end this podcast by doing that. Is there anything else we need to cover with the greatest hoax in was it paleological? Am I saying that right?
Paleontological.
Paleontological. Anything else we need to cover with it? Is this the greatest hoax in scientific history, or just this one branch of science?
I don't know of a bigger one. I don't. I think maybe some physicists or chemists maybe might argue me on that, but just because this touches geology, this touches biology, uh, and was so egregious that it lasted so long. Yeah, you'd have a hard time convincing me that there is a more significant hoax in the history of science.
Well, if that sounds like a challenge to you,
Absolutely.
go ahead and take a look at the notes, pardon me, in our show notes, and that may well be a future episode. And hey, you may even we may ask you to be a guest on that episode. But for
Well,
now,
there is another hoax that I have in mind
oh,
that is not as
go
big
ahead.
as this one, but more recent that we will talk about eventually.
Oh, all right, cliffhanger, which I don't even
Yeah.
know what Gavin's talking about, so that's really exciting. In the meantime, this has been episode 47 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin, and we will see you all next week. Take care, everybody.